There was a kind of freedom in the 1980s that you did not have to explain. You did not need a plan for it. You did not need a calendar invitation. You did not need a group chat that took longer than the hangout itself. You just went. And somehow, you arrived inside a world that already knew how to hold you. Not at home, not at school, not at work, somewhere in between. A place where you could be real without being impressive. A place where you could be seen without performing. If you grew up in that era, you might remember it as a mall, or a diner, or a library that felt quietly alive, or an arcade where you learned how to lose with grace and win without cruelty, or a front porch, or a corner store where the cashier knew your face. We talk about the 1980s like it was a set of objects. Neon signs, old televisions, cassette tapes, bright packaging, a world that looks warm in memory, like a photograph left in the sun. But what mattered most was not the objects. It was the spaces. The places that taught you something important without giving you a lecture. They taught you that belonging was not something you earned. Belonging was something you participated in. There is a name for these spaces. Third places. Home is the first place. That is where you return to yourself. That is where you rest. That is where you keep the private parts of your life. Work or school is the second place. That is where you produce. That is where you prove. That is where you are measured. The third place is where you breathe. It is the human middle ground. A public space that is not purely transactional. A social space that does not demand excellence from you. A space where you can show up as a person, not a resume. And this is the part that might surprise younger viewers. Third places were not always loud. They were not always exciting. They were not always glamorous. They were just consistent. They were the background fabric of life. And when you have fabric, you do not notice it. You only notice it when it tears. Imagine the mall, not as a temple of shopping, but as a small indoor city. You could walk for hours without having to buy anything. You could sit, you could wander, you could run into people you knew and people you did not know, and both interactions mattered in different ways. You learned how to exist around strangers. You learned how to be casually polite. You learned how to tolerate awkwardness. You learned how to recover from it. The mall was a training ground for adulthood that did not call itself training. You had the food court, where friend groups blended and split and blended again. You had the bench outside the bookstore where people waited and watched and belonged to the day. You had the hallway near the cinema, where time slowed down because you were there before the movie, not rushing into it. The important part was that you could be together without having a reason. That is a rare thing now. A diner played a different role. The diner was not optimized. It did not ask you to be efficient. It did not try to rush you out the door if you were not spending enough money. It let conversations stretch. People came in wearing their real lives, work boots, school jackets, tired faces, weekend smiles. You sat, you ate, you talked. Sometimes you did not even talk much. Sometimes you just sat with someone and let the world move around you. There is a kind of healing in that. Not a dramatic healing, not the type that comes with a breakthrough speech. A quiet healing, the kind that happens when your nervous system finally believes you're not alone. And then there was the library. A younger generation might picture it as a place you go to study, but in many towns it was something else. It was a room where you could share silence. You could be near other people without having to entertain them. You could be a child, a teenager, an adult and still feel welcome. You wandered through shelves and found worlds you did not know you needed. You sat at tables where strangers became familiar faces over time. You learned that community is not always loud. Sometimes community is simply being allowed to exist in the same space as others, without pressure. You could feel the difference between loneliness and solitude there. Loneliness is being unseen. Solitude is being alone but not abandoned. Third places helped people learn that difference, and the front porch, or the driveway, or the sidewalk. Those were not just pieces of architecture, they were social technology. They created small moments of exposure. You saw neighbours without scheduling them. You nodded, you waved, you exchanged small talk that seemed meaningless until you realised it was glue. Those tiny interactions created something psychologists and sociologists talk about in very serious language, but you do not need the theory to feel it. They created trust, not deep trust, not the kind you reserve for your closest people, a softer trust. The trust that says the world around you contains familiar faces, the trust that says you belong to a place, not just to a screen. There is a concept that sounds almost insulting until you understand how powerful it is. Weak ties. These are not your best friends. These are not your family. These are the people you recognize, the barista who learns your order, the librarian who smiles when you walk in, the guy who always shows up at the same pickup game, the older woman who walks her dog past your house at the same time every afternoon. Weak ties are one of the quiet protections of mental health, because they remind your brain of something ancient. You are part of a tribe, not a perfect tribe, not a tribe that agrees on everything, not a tribe that never disappoints you, but a tribe that includes you. And now, look around. Many people today have more contacts than ever, more followers than any human being would have been able to hold in their life a century ago. And still, something feels thin. We're connected, but we're not anchored. We know what everyone is doing, but we do not feel known. It is not because people became colder. It is not because younger generations are broken. It is not because older generations were magically tougher. It is because the places that used to carry the weight of everyday belonging have been shrinking. Not always dramatically, often quietly. A third place disappears and you do not mourn it like you mourn a person. You just adjust. The mall becomes emptier, then it becomes a series of locked gates. Then it becomes a memory you mention when you pass the exit on the highway. The video store becomes a new type of store and then it becomes nothing. The neighborhood diner becomes a chain restaurant and then it becomes a bank. The front porch culture fades because life speeds up, because commutes get longer, because schedules tighten, because everyone is tired. And then a strange thing happens. The world becomes more efficient, but people become less well. Anxiety rises, loneliness rises. The sense of meaning gets harder to hold, and you begin to feel guilty for it. You begin to think something is wrong with you. But what if it is not a personal failure? What if it is environmental? When third places vanish, life becomes two extremes. Private life behind closed doors, public life as performance. You're either alone or you're presenting yourself. And the human spirit cannot live like that forever. The spirit needs a middle ground. It needs a place where you can show up unpolished, where you can run into familiar faces without needing a reason, where you can be part of the world without being measured by it. That is what the 1980s offered, often without realizing it. Not perfection, not paradise, but a rhythm. A social rhythm that made it easier to belong. And the lesson is not that we should rewind history. The lesson is simpler. We can build it again. We can create places where we are allowed to be human together. Not as a trend, not as a productivity hack, as a form of care, as a way to remember what we are. The loss did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened like a slow dimming, a series of small changes that each looked reasonable on their own, a longer commute, a tighter schedule, a neighborhood that stopped being walkable, a public space that quietly became pay to stay, a habit that disappeared because everyone was tired. And then one day you look around and realize something is missing. Not a building, a pattern. The pattern of running into people, the pattern of being known in small ways, the pattern of having somewhere to go that did not require a special reason. For a long time, society treated these spaces as optional, like decoration. But third places were never decoration. They were infrastructure. They were the emotional roads and bridges that kept people from living like isolated islands. When you remove that infrastructure, the world still functions. The lights still turn on, the economy still moves, but the inner life of a community changes. People become more careful, more guarded, more lonely without being able to explain why. One of the biggest shifts was distance. A lot of modern life is built around driving. That is not a moral failure. That is design. When everything requires a drive, you stop doing the small, spontaneous things. You stop dropping by. You stop drifting into places. You do not casually visit a coffee shop that takes 30 minutes to reach. You schedule it. You plan it. And when your week becomes heavy, you cancel it. Spontaneity is fragile. It needs closeness. When the places that hold community move farther away, community becomes harder to maintain. Another shift was money. Many third places in the past were cheap or free, or they allowed you to exist without purchasing much. You could sit at the library all afternoon. You could walk the mall and spend nothing. You could hang around a neighborhood park without feeling like you were trespassing on someone else's business model. Now, many public spaces feel like they come with an unspoken rule. If you are not spending, you are not welcome. Again, this is not about blaming any one group. It is about noticing the emotional consequences. When belonging has a price tag, people begin to ration it. They stay home. They scroll. They tell themselves it is fine, and in a certain sense it is fine. You can survive that way. But surviving is not the same as being held. Then there is the pace of life. A lot of adults today are not avoiding community because they do not care. They are avoiding it because they are depleted, they work more, they worry more, they manage more. Even leisure has become something to optimize. You do not just rest, you track rest. You do not just meet friends, you schedule it like a meeting. You do not just go for a walk, you measure it. Life becomes a constant project. And in a project, third places feel like extras. But this is the trap. Third places are not extras. They are the thing that makes the project bearable. Technology also changed the shape of social life. The internet gave us incredible gifts. It helped people find their communities across distance. It helped shy people connect. It helped niche interests become shared worlds. But the screen also replaced certain social functions that third places used to provide. Before, you went somewhere to be around others. Now you can be around others while physically alone. And that creates a new kind of experience. You are connected, but your body is not convinced. Your brain sees faces. Your nervous system feels isolation. And you may not notice the difference at first because the stimulation is strong. But over time, it can leave you feeling strangely untethered, as if you are living near life instead of inside it. This is where the generational lesson becomes valuable, because every generation carries a piece of the map. Baby boomers often learned community as duty. They were raised in a world where you showed up, not because you felt inspired, because you were part of something. Sometimes that created pressure, sometimes it created strength, and often it created a deep familiarity with people outside their immediate circle. Many boomers are not naturally sentimental about the past. They are practical. They miss third places because they miss the structure that made life feel stable. Generation X often learned community as independence. They had more unsupervised time. They had more space to roam. They built friendships through repeated presence. They learned how to be with people without needing constant emotional explanation. That is not always easy. It can make feelings harder to name. But it also created a kind of social resilience, a comfort with the ordinary texture of togetherness. Millennials grew up in transition. Many still remember malls, libraries, and public hangouts, but they also grew up inside rising competition, more credentials, more pressure, more anxiety about falling behind. For many millennials, community became something you had to maintain while chasing stability. And chasing stability is exhausting. Generation Z grew up in the most connected era in history. They have access to everyone, everywhere, at all times. And yet, a lot of them carry a heavy loneliness, because so much of social life became mediated. It is hard to build weak ties online. Online spaces often skip the gentle middle. They jump straight to performance. You're either invisible or you are broadcasting. That is not a criticism of Gen Z. It is a description of the environment they inherited. And this is the heart of the lesson for younger generations. You do not need to become like Gen X. You do not need to live like it is 1985. You do not need to reject technology. You just need to rebuild the missing middle. Because human beings do not only need close relationships, they also need casual belonging. They need familiar faces. They need rituals that require only presence. And the good news is that this is something you can practice, not as an identity, not as a lifestyle brand, as a simple decision to place your body back into the world. Start with one idea. Near beats perfect. Choose a place that is close enough to visit without effort. A library, a local cafe, a community centre, a small gym class, a volunteer group, a book club, a running group, a farmer's market. The specific place matters less than the pattern it creates. Then remember the second idea. Frequency beats intensity. A third place is not built through one long dramatic hangout. It is built through repetition. 20 minutes on a Tuesday, 30 minutes on a Saturday morning. A short stop that you do not overthink. When you go often enough, you become a familiar face. And that is where the magic begins. Because familiarity does not require deep conversation. Familiarity itself is comfort. You do not have to become outgoing. You do not have to turn it into networking. You do not have to be the most interesting person in the room. You just have to return. That is how weak ties form. That is how the world stops feeling like a hallway you sprint through. Then comes the third idea. Belonging does not need a performance. In a healthy third place, you are allowed to be ordinary. You can show up tired. You can show up quiet. You can show up with nothing impressive to report. You're not there to prove your worth, you're there to participate in something simple and human. This is especially important for a culture that has trained people to monetize their personality, to brand their identity, to turn every hobby into a side hustle, to turn every moment into content. There is nothing wrong with creativity, there is nothing wrong with ambition, but the soul needs at least one space where it is not for sale. A third place can be that space, a place where you can be a person, not a product. If you want a practical way to begin, try a gentle 7-day experiment. Day 1. Pick one place within 15 minutes that you can visit again. Day 2. Go for 20 minutes and do not demand that it feel magical. Day 3. Return at the same time. Day 4. Make one small gesture, a nod, a hello, a thank you. Day 5. Return again and notice if any face feels familiar. Day 6. Invite one person to join you, even if they only come once. Day 7. Decide whether this place can become part of your week, not a major event, a rhythm. Because rhythm is what we lost, and rhythm is what rebuilds us. A lot of people are waiting for society to feel normal again, but what they really mean is that they want to feel held. They want life to feel like it has seams, like it has places where you fit without forcing yourself in. That is not childish. That is not weak. That is human. And this is where the 1980s can teach something without becoming a museum. The lesson is not the decade. The lesson is the design. Design a life with a middle. A life where you're not only alone or on display, a life that includes small public belonging. If you are a Gen X viewer, this might feel like remembering an old language. You might realize you miss it more than you admitted. Not because you want to go back, because you want to bring something forward. If you are a younger viewer, this might feel like discovering a tool you never knew existed. A tool that does not live on your phone, a tool that lives in repetition, in proximity, in quiet consistency. A tool that makes anxiety a little less loud, not by arguing with it, but by giving your nervous system evidence. Evidence that you are part of a world that recognizes you. Third places do not solve every problem, but they soften the edges of life. They reduce the sense that you are carrying everything alone. They give you a community that is not based on constant intimacy, just shared space, shared time, shared humanity. And maybe that is what we are truly hungry for, not more connection, more belonging. If you have ever had a third place, name it in your mind. A mall hallway, a library table, a diner booth, a porch step, a park bench. Now imagine creating a new one. Not identical, not nostalgic for nostalgia's sake, just real. A place you can return to. Because a town is not its buildings. A town is the moments when people keep running into each other, and those moments can still exist. One place, one habit, one small return at a time.